Hey guys, Dan here from IgniteNet, and today I'm going to talk about the IgniteNet MetroLinq tips and best practices. So, kind of put this document together based on feedback I've been getting over time, and so without further ado, all right. So, first thing I'm going to point out is we have a cloud, and it's cloud.ignitenet.com, and in the cloud, it's free to create an account on the cloud, and there's a link path tool, 60 gigahertz link path tool. So it'll calculate the signal strength and even factor in rain. So depending on where you are, rain fade, you could factor that in as well. You're always best to calculate with the worst case scenario, meaning with rain fade in mind for your calculation. So if you ever have any doubt of, will the link work or how well it'll work, go to the cloud, like I said, the free cloud, and go to the link path tool and create links. It factors in which radio you're going to use. Which radio depends on the type of antenna it has and what kind of gain it has. The channel, you could factor in which channel, because on 60 gigahertz the channel actually does matter, and of course distance, and then rain fade. So it factors all those things in. It's a good tool. Uh, Next thing I want to point out is the cloud now supports 50 devices for free. So I think a lot of people don't know the cloud since last year was upgraded to where it used to be just two devices for free. But now it's 50. You get 50 devices that it could be managed on the cloud for free. After 50, it's still which is still very reasonable, the $99 per year. So not bad either way. Okay, so one thing I want to point out, this is huge, and I've seen a lot of support issues for this. It is the boot banks. Okay, so the firmware, there's two boot banks on IgniteNet radios. There's a primary and an alternate. And the alternate gets triggered if there's like a power issue or the radio won't boot up right. It may go into the alternate boot bank in order to run. The problem is, what most people do is they'll load one firmware, the latest firmware, which is good, but forget to update the alternate boot bank. And you might be running the latest, greatest firmware on the primary, but still have very old and outdated firmware on the alternate. And if and when there's, say, a power issue and the radio were to be triggered over to an old firmware version, you might encounter problems. So much so, let's say, for example, one of our firmware versions, 2.2, won't even link with the newer version, 2.4. So this is a major issue. You really have to, imagine if it failed over to 2.2, right? And then it will no longer link to your other side, which has got the 2.4 firmware on it. So the best thing to do is load firmware twice. So both the alternate and the primary, both the later firmware. Now, in some firmware versions, later versions requires an intermediate firmware to get to the latest firmware. You have to have an intermediate step. This means you're actually loading firmware 3 times. You're loading the intermediate and then the final version twice. You need to do that twice so you clear out the intermediate firmware, because you also do not want to be failing over to the intermediate firmware on your alternate bank. So that's the trick. To check it, you just go to the dashboard on the radio locally. The dashboard will show you both banks. On the cloud, it will if you have it on the cloud, but you do have to have a later firmware version for it to show on the cloud both banks. So that's good. You need to check that. This is something that I see a lot of support issues with, not loading the latest firmware on both banks. Another thing is, that's kind of related, is make sure, especially for point-to-point, you're on the same firmware version. Don't have mixed and mismatched firmware. Now, for point-to-multipoint, you won't obviously have the exact same firmware. You'd have, let's say, an Omni has its firmware. It's not going to be the exact same version, but have it the same generation. The current firmware. You got in this case 2.4.2. Have that for both the client side and the Omni. So that's a, I think it's just best practices. These are things might be a little obvious, but I see a lot of times overlooked. Okay, next thing we talk about. Okay, so for point to multipoint, and that's referring, when I refer to point to multipoint, I'm referring to the LW, the BF18, or the Omni. Those are all our sector radios, the base station sector, 120 degree sectors. Now the Omni has 3 120-degree sectors, but effectively it's really just three 120-degree radios inside of it to create 360 degrees of coverage. It's best to use channels 1, 2, or 3, not channel 4. That's different than conventional thinking because we know that for 60 gigahertz, the oxygen absorption is peaked around channel 2. So actually, channel 4 is actually better to use when it comes to reducing oxygen absorption. But the reason for this is because actually our antennas for the sectors they have more gain on channels 1, 2, and 3. They're actually the dB gain is a bit down on channel 4. So, and figure point to multipoint, the link distances aren't really that far. The farthest you could really recommend doing is about 500 meters. The amount of attenuation from oxygen isn't really that much yet. The difference in the dB gain is more of a factor. So for our single sectors, you can just leave it on the default channel 1. On the Omni, it defaults to channels 1, 2, and 3. Leave it on channels 1, 2, and 3. Reserve channel 4 or 4.5 for point-to-point backhaul links for that. That's the best thing to do. So that's a little different than people realize. You go to channel 4, you'll actually see the signal drop about a dB or 2 at a couple hundred meters. You're like, how could it get worse? Well, that's why. Okay, so for next one, for point-to-point, use the highest channel, channel 4 or 4.5, even if you can. Some areas you can't, but channel 4.5 is best. It's furthest away from the center. Channel 2, 60 gigahertz oxygen absorption. In most cases, I recommend go with the 35 centimeter 42 dB gain antenna radio because they're very close in price. So why not just go with the higher gain? It gives you more link budget to work with. It also makes your average MCS rate on average higher, right? Because your link is better, stronger. So unless the link is very close, like 100 meters or less, then I'd say, yeah, sure, go with the 19 centimeter in that case. Okay, now what kind of signal strength is good and bad? On 60 gigahertz, it's a little different. 5 gigahertz, I know a lot of people are, we're familiar with what 5 gigahertz is good and bad. The noise floor of 5 gigahertz is in the 90s, typically, negative 95, stuff like that. That's common for 5 gigahertz, but 60 is a little different. So we recommend a signal no stronger than negative 30 dBm. That's pretty convention. That's pretty common. But what's not is we say no weaker than negative 60. It's like negative 60. That's compared to the 5 gigahertz, you could have much weaker signal than that. Actually, we recommend about negative 55 or better. Actually, negative 60 is even starting to get a little bit marginal. And here's why. For MCS2, you need a negative 68 signal, okay, for 60 gigahertz. And part of the reason why all this is, and how come, what's wrong? What's wrong with 60? Why is it so bad? What's wrong with your radios or something? No, it's not like that. It's what it is it's a 2 gigahertz wide channel for one. Okay, so the thermal noise floor is negative 84. It's because the channel width is so wide. So negative 84. And our MCS2 is at negative 68. MCS1 is a couple more dB down from there. But the thing is, MCS1 is just control and management frames. MCS2 is the minimum MCS rate for data transfer. So negative 68. So figure if you have a negative 60 signal, you only got 8 dB of margin. That's not very much. So we like you to be down in, let's say, negative 55. If you really want to have no failover on 5 gigahertz, say even with rain, like factoring even in rain, then you should be in the 40s. Like negative 40, 9 or better would really be an ideal, like a good amount of link budget to factor in even handling, staying up even in rain and snow. I mean, a bit if it's ridiculous rain or snow, yeah, maybe that'd be an issue. But in most cases, like say a normal amount of rain and snow and stuff, the 40s, being in the 40s is going to pretty much be up on 60. You still should have the 5 gigahertz failover enabled and there for backup just in case. Now, we say to reduce the power on the radio if the signal's too strong. If you do let's say you do have a really short link and you wind up having a negative 20 dBm, don't misalign the antennas on purpose to have the signal drop. Actually align them properly and then reduce the power instead to get the signal down a little bit. On the newer firmware 2.4, 8.1 or later, you have to actually change the MCS rate from auto to MCS 9 to then have the option to be able to select the power from auto down to, say, a lower output. The maximum output in the default for auto on the power is 14 dBm on 60 gigahertz. So that's the people ask, well, how I can't adjust it? It doesn't let me. Well, you just have to change the MCS rate first from auto to MCS 9 to be able to change the output power. It's kind of a not too often a thing that's needed, but that's how you do that. Okay, next thing is distances. Okay, so supported distances for point to multipoint were the LW, the BF18, and the Omni. They're all about the same gain, by the way. Those three all have the same output power, 14 dBm on 60 gigahertz, and about 18 dB gain. When you're using the 19 centimeter client, the 36 dBi radio, we recommend about 25 meters to 100 meters. You can go shorter, but you'd have to turn down the power at less than 25 meters. Now, 100 meters max, or maximum 250 meters. Actually, I don't recommend that. I just say go with the higher gain radio, which is the 35 centimeter, 42 dB gain radio. Remember, the price difference is very close. Just go with that instead if you're going further than 100 meters. That's really the best thing to do. You can go with a 19 centimeter on one side and a 42 dB gain, let's say, on the other side of a point-to-point link, or you can go 236 dBi 19s point-to-point. I'd say for point-to-point, pretty much go with the 42 dBi 35 centimeter radios. You know, why not just have more budget to work with the signal strength? So anyway, max distances for the 42 dBi to another 42 dBi, we recommend up to about 1 mile. People go further, but you're really gonna require the 5 gigahertz failover in rain if you're going more than a mile or 1.6 kilometers. We say maximum distance 2.5 kilometers. We actually have customers. You put it on a channel 4.5 with a half channel mode, 1080 megahertz instead of the 2160 megahertz channel, and you gain a 3 dB gain by narrowing the channel, a little bit improvement there. But at the end of the day, we really don't recommend going that far because you will have in rain and weather it would be going down, and you'd have to rely on the 5 gigahertz. Okay, next one is use the 5 gigahertz backup. Yes, and people are hesitant to. Oh, I'm in this area that there's so much 5 gigahertz noise and interference. I don't even want to turn on the radios. Well, you can certainly design your 60 gigahertz with enough budget to where you're really never really going to rely on failing over to 60 gigahertz. Say if you're in the negative 40s or better signal strength on 60, then you should be okay. Probably won't ever need it, but why not just put on a narrow, like say channel 20 megahertz wide channel on 5 gigahertz and maybe throw it on channel 165 or something. You don't have to push a lot of data. It's just transmitting. It's not, there's not a lot of channel utilization, right, from radios. They're really just a failover. I like having it because if you screw up a setting on 60 gigahertz, at least you can still get into the radio remotely, right, over the link, over the 5 gigahertz link. It's kind of nice to have that backup even just for that. The backup radio, by the way, it's an 802.11 AC 2x2 radio. So default set to an 80 megahertz wide channel. If you actually don't have too much interference on 5 gigahertz and an 80 megahertz channel, you can actually push a couple hundred megabits through it. But typically, and for where our radios are used, is the strength is the fact that it's not 5 gigahertz, it's 60 gigahertz. So I could understand there's a lot of cases where 5 gigahertz is saturated. That's why you're going with our product 60 gigahertz radio to avoid the interference on 5 gigahertz. So there's chances that there's so much RF, and I'll say in some cases like hanging a radio on a tower where there's a whole bunch of TDMA on 5 gigahertz. The TDMA doesn't follow 802.11. And what I say is 802.11 is a polite protocol. It's nice. If it hears another station on the same channel, it'll be nice and take turns. But TDMA is not nice. It just transmits. It don't care. It's going to interfere on a 802.11 radio. And the problem is with 802.11, it's a polite protocol. It actually has this thing called energy detect. And if it picks up RF on the frequency, it'll just not transmit and wait till it stops transmitting. With TDMA, if it's nearby in a very close proximity, it interpret a near far problem just even on a different channel as noise, or let's say a signal on the channel you're on. And so you don't want to mount these super close to another 5 gigahertz TDMA radio. It's you're asking for problems, and then our radios won't transmit because it's following the 802.11 protocol. Best practices, of course, just mount it further away from other 5 gigahertz radios, just like you should. All right, next one I'm going to talk about is the alignment scope. Okay, so remember, these are very directional. The client radios are very directional. Even the 36 dBi, 19 centimeters, 3 degrees, that's already very directional. And then the 42 dB gain, 35 centimeter radio, that's 1 degree beam width, super narrow. So I'd say in almost all cases, just get the alignment scope. You'll thank me later. It just saves time. Yes, I know people, almost bragging rights. I could do it. I could do it without the scope. I'm good. But hey, you know what? Time is money. It's quicker to get the scope. And the scope is not to get you perfectly aligned. The scope is to get you connected and linked up on 60. Then you fine tune it by using, the RSSI. You go up, down, left, right, up, down, left, right a couple times. Get the signal as best as possible. Within a few dB of ideal is what you want. Maybe maximum up to maybe say 5 dB from ideal. If it's worse than 5 dB from ideal, then you're not aligned properly and you're going to encounter issues. So you definitely want to make sure you're within a few dB, but you're not going to get perfect. I mean, if you do, great, but allow yourself a couple dB. Okay, don't go crazy over it, but that scope is going to be a lifesaver. Now, it'll get you linked. Now, the scope itself, sometimes it's a little off. You might have the crosshairs perfect, and then you wind up doing the RSSI adjustment. You'll see, oh, I'm actually a little off to the top left corner of the scope. Make a note of that. That scope is going to kind of be. It's kind of like a real gun scope where you have to fine tune it when you add it. You install it on your gun. Kind of the same thing. So once you establish that the scope is a little bit, let's say everything's a little bit off, let's say the top left. That's where it kind of likes it, where it's a little more in line with what the scope is. Maybe even take a picture through your phone into the scope to get a reference on that. Just to keep it in mind for future installations. Like I said, the scope is for getting it linked, get the ideal signal. You want to do it via adjusting the radio without the scope. You want to do it based on RSSI. Okay, next one talk about is the not using the same channels at the same location. Okay, I think it's kind of obvious. Here's the thing. There's only 4 channels on the 60 gigahertz to work with our radios. Channels 1, 2, 3, and 4. There is 4.5, but the problem is they're they're channel wide. So you can go half channels, but in actuality, you're still going to be very close to. At the end of the day, here I'll give you an example. You have a hub home model, and you have point to point. So you're using channel 4. You have an Omni on that, so you're using channels 1, 2, and 3. Then you want to do another hop. What channel do you use? Well, I definitely wouldn't use channels 1, 2, and 3 because the Omni, these are sector antennas. They're going to be more susceptible to receiving and transmitting a wider range, right, than a directional. So in this case, I would mount the next hop radio on this. It would be on channel 4, but it'd be on a different part of the, let's say, a house or area. It would definitely separate them a good distance apart, and a few, several feet apart. That would probably work okay. Actually, 60 gigahertz is pretty forgiving, actually. Figure the wavelength is literally, millimeter. It's 5 millimeters. It's, half a centimeter wavelength, very small, about 12 times smaller than 5 gigahertz, right? The frequency is 12 times higher, so the frequency, the wavelength is 12 times smaller. That means the number of wavelengths you are away is, in its perspective, is 12 times more than 5 gigahertz. So if you mounted another one of our point-to-point radios, say 10 feet apart, that'd be kind of like mounting 2 5 gigahertz radios 120 feet apart, kind of, kind of a similar effect, if you will. What you don't want to do is mount even the radio on different channels within a foot or two of each other. You still can have this near-far problem. Even though let's say our 42 dBi very directional radio has a front-to-back ratio of like 60 dB, it's very high. You still don't want to be like 1 foot away from the Omni. It's just not a good idea, even on a different channel. give some actual separation. It's a radio, regardless. So you do want to separate them as much as you can. Usually a few feet, like a meter or more, is on different channels is usually enough. Okay, now there's a setting on the uh, sectors, the LW, the BF18, and the Omni for antenna beam width. Um, this setting is not to increase distance. It actually just reduces the beamforming TX RX, the scanning range that the beamforming goes, if you will, from left to right. The antenna itself is 120 degrees. The definition of antenna beam width is the negative 3 dB down point. So we're just talking about the 3 dB down point when it talks 120 degrees, not the width of the antenna's capability. Actually, the radio's capability, the sectors, is actually 160 degrees. If you go into the radio, you'll see the scanning ranges are going to be plus and minus 80 degrees. It has a 10-degree beam width when it beamforms. The beam itself, when talking to a client, each client has a different beam potentially if it's in different locations. Would use a different beam. But the beam width of the beam, when beamformed, is 10 degrees wide horizontally, and it's actually a fixed 32 degrees or so vertical. That doesn't change. The vertical beam width's about 32, but the horizontal beam width's 10 degrees. So let's say, and what it is actually, it's a plus and minus 80. There's 32 discrete beams that are 5-degree intervals. So like beam 16, if you will, would be kind of like center at 0 degrees. Beam 32 would be at the 80, it'd be at the last one, which would be like plus 80 degrees. Beam 1 would be minus 80 degrees. So figure the first beam is minus 80, the second beam is minus 75, the third beam is negative 70 degrees from center. And that's how it talks to different clients. The RF beam width itself, when beamformed, is down to 10 degrees. So it's kind of confusing. And there's a setting in the radio to set the beam width from 120 to 90 to 60. That doesn't change what the RF is beamformed down to. That's still going to be 10 degrees no matter what. What it does is it just reduces the sounding frames, how far it will scan and talk to clients. So there's really not really much use for it to narrow the beam. It doesn't give you any more dB gain. It just kind of, actually, if anything, it will reduce potential interference if there was, say, you wanted to have 4 sectors and they're all, maybe you can set it to 90 degrees and then you have 4 sectors so they won't overlap on each other. I mean, in most cases I say don't do that. Just leave it at 120. The sounding frames don't have that much overhead. It doesn't matter. And what if you want to add another client down the way? You always have the option, to stay within the 160 degrees actually of actual beam width it has when you factor in the 32 across 5. Now, the 5 degrees each. Now, the thing is, now, at 120 degrees or plus and minus 60, if you're at 60 degrees, that's down 3 dB from center. If you're way out at, let's say, 80 degrees, you're probably down about 5 dB, 6 dB. Your signal's definitely going to be degraded. You should be on let's say you had the Omni and you're on sector 1 and you're at plus 80. You're on the wrong sector. You should be at sector 2 and therefore you'd connect at a negative 40 degree on the sector 2. So if you're greater than 60 and you see your sector position when you talk to a client and it's greater than 60 or greater than minus 60, you're on the wrong sector on an Omni. Now, if you have more than that on your single sector radio, then you just pretty much have to adjust the radio. And if you have clients on each end, you got to get another sector to cover more area. So hopefully that covers that. It's a kind of an interesting thing. You got the physical, the 3 dB down point at 120 degrees, but the antenna itself, it's 160 degrees of transmit receive capability, and it beamforms to clients 10 degrees wide horizontally, 32 degrees vertically. So I know it's a lot, but hopefully you got that. Okay, next one is the Omni. Okay, the vertical beam width of the Omni is about 32 degrees. That's its 3 dB down points. plus and minus 16 degrees. I'm talking about the vertical beam width. Remember, the horizontal is 120 for the 3 dB down points. Now, the thing is, though, we found that it's actually, you don't want to go more than about 10 degrees down tilt on the Omni. Like, meaning, if you can't adjust the Omni is omnidirectional. You can't down tilt the Omni, right? So I'm relying on the 10 degrees down, meaning the beam width vertically can allow for 10 degrees downwards. If it's mounted very high, it's going to be a problem because you're going to have not enough down tilt, and you can't down tilt the Omni because it's omnidirectional. So in that case, if you need more than 10 degrees of down tilt, um, just don't use the Omni. Go with single sector 120s like the BF18 and point it downwards. That's the way to go. Go with 3 BF18s so you then can have the ability to down tilt them. That's kind of the solution for that in those cases. So that's a use case with the Omnis. I found a couple problems where people would mount very high up and kind of overshoot, if you will, the clients down below. Okay, next thing is the LR bracket. Okay, so I recommend using the LR, the long range bracket. It's a little more money, but it's, remember, these radios are very directional. The 35 centimeter radio is 42 dB gain, 1 degree beam width. So the LR bracket's much nicer. You could fine tune it much easier and adjust it, and it's much more robust. Let's say in like wind or things. So like, it's just better to use. You'll thank me later, especially like point to point. Now for point to point, you definitely need those. And if you're also, remember the alignment scopes, you really need to buy, let's say, 2 alignment scopes to do it on both ends. If you're going, let's say, 1 kilometer, you need both ends to be looking at each other to even start seeing each other on 60 gigahertz, to then allow yourself to then fine tune it based on RSSI. Okay, next one, last one, the Fresnel zone. So Fresnel zone is actually proportional to the frequency and the distance. So one thing good at 60 gigahertz, the frequency or the wavelength is so high, or the frequency is so high, the wavelength is so small. It's proportional to wavelength. So the wavelength's very small. So the Fresnel zone's very small. And even at like about 1 kilometer, the Fresnel zone's only about 2 feet. Very small. So it's pretty forgiving. So it's good. I mean, you may want to consider a little bit of more Fresnel zone in case for your 5 gigahertz failover possibly, but for 60 gigahertz, your Fresnel zone's awesome. That's like not an issue. Fresnel zone, but what you do encounter on 60 gigahertz is more prone to multipath. And we found that some issues, especially mounting on roofs and things, that you might, let's say you have a radio mounted on the top of a roof, but it's a metal sloped roof. And so having, say, a metal roof, you might get the signal to reflect off the roof coming to that device or the radio and cause issues. So we kind of say don't have anything within 15 degrees for the first 2 meters in front of the antenna. So the trick is just mount it higher. You wouldn't want to mount it, say, right at the roof line on the peak of a metal roof. You'd want to have it on the edge of the roof, or mounted on, let's say, a tripod at like maybe 6 feet up above the roof, so you won't get that reflected signal. And the dead giveaway for multipath, by the way, because it's kind of hard to, there's 2 ways. A lot of times what'll happen is you'll think you're aligned, you do your up, down, left, right, you try to get the best RSSI, but you just never get it, say, within 10 dB of what it should be. You know that, then you're actually not getting the direct beam, you're getting a multipath reflected beam. If you can never get within about 3 or 4 or 5, maybe 5 dB maximum, off from ideal, you could probably, that's okay. But if you're 10 dB off, then there's something not aligned properly. You shouldn't be that many dB off from what the ideal link should be. So that's kind of a dead giveaway. The other thing, of course, is that your throughputs are bad. Your signal's good, but you're just not getting good performance. The throughput and the latencies are just kind of all over the place. That's kind of a dead giveaway too. Or it could be indicative of co-channel or adjacent channel interference we talked about, which earlier I was mentioning, about using the same channel on 60. Like, how would I know I'm getting interference? Well, one way is just simply to turn off one radio, do a throughput test, turn on the other radio on the same channel, see if your throughputs change much on a real like iPerf test, load it down and see if you see any difference, and then you'll know if you're getting interference. there is no spectrum analysis on 60. Let's say, spectrum analyzer mode. So that's really the best way we do it. We just do speed tests and compare them back to back. And if you don't really see much degradation, then you'll know. You'll know right away if your speeds are way down when both radios are on. Then you know you got interference. So hopefully these tips help you guys out. So I'm definitely open to any other tips or suggestions. I'm all ears. I like to get feedback. So if you got any more ideas, and you know, definitely reach out to me, and I could add more things. Thanks, guys, for your time.